So I'll ask Michelle to come up. Michelle is going to be presenting on a water governance project looking at some of the risk factors for a diversified water supply option for Adelaide. I think it's on behalf of Jennifer Mackay's
It is,
project.
yeah. So thank you, everyone. And I will be presenting on Professor Jennifer Mackay's water governance project that she's undertaking for the Goyder Institute. And Jennifer's based at UniSA and is really doing this as a support in terms of developing the urban water blueprint, and governance is certainly one of the issues in terms of that implementation. Like Peter said, we can have the tools, but there are some implementation barriers. So she's looking at assessing and providing advice regarding what some of those barriers may or may not be. And so to do that, she's really got two approaches. She's undertaking a literature review and developing case studies on international and Australian-based case studies. And she's also undertaking a series of interviews with professionals in the water sector to get from their knowledge as well as their perception about what the barriers are on a range of related issues in terms of governance and implementation issues for diversifying water supplies, particularly the new sources of water. And so in terms of the case studies, there are a whole suite including Asia, the US, Africa and the Middle East, as well as broadly across Australia, and really analysing the impediments and opportunities in terms of the governance options in those areas and some of the approaches that they're doing. So there are detailed explanations, but there's also, I guess we're trying to get a bit of a summary table, a bit of a cheat sheet, a look up, so you can just have a look at, how people are doing it elsewhere, and perhaps there are learnings that we can implement here while we have an opportunity to do so. And the interviews with water professionals, there's been an initial interview process, and I'll provide some results on that, but there's also a more detailed one that's, I think, just started to be undertaken at the moment that really teases out some of the more detailed issues about, perceptions as well as reality, if that makes sense, because sometimes we perceive things to be a barrier, but in reality they're perhaps not as much as what we thought. So in terms of the case studies, that there's probably no surprises really in the analysis that, there are different approaches that have been undertaken in terms of diversifying water supplies, and the institutional, I think it comes down to the institutional arrangements for delivering those objectives are not always clear, and that has caused a few issues. And the political pathways, I think changing the political cycles and difference in opinion, as we've seen in some cases, particularly in Australia, have been a barrier in themselves. So there are a number of issues from the review that regulatory regimes often lack overall coordination and are seen as not so much of or perhaps a barrier, but also that uncoordination causes more time and effort and delays in approvals processes, and really unclear about what information you might need to address the requirements for each of the health, environmental and economic regulation. Restructuring and the role separation within public sector departments and who's responsible and accountable, and having many people look after different parts of it, I think has been identified as an issue, leading on to the lack of clarity about roles, responsibilities and accountabilities. I guess the last point about conflicting agendas relating to water right issues and dealing with recycling, opponents to recycling or reuse have certainly, I think, are well known here, particularly in Australia. In terms of the initial interview process, again, so there really aren't too many surprises in what's been identified, but certainly when it comes to some of the policy challenges to implement, focusing specifically on diversifying water resources in Adelaide, that again it comes back to the regulation, seeing there's too many different regulations and licences, and they're all administered by different organisations, which adds to the complexity and lack of clarity about what process you actually need to follow, and it takes too long. The clarity on rights and responsibilities, so if you pump it into the groundwater, who actually owns it? and as well as that integrated framework for bringing it all together. So I think that presents some opportunities and some leadership that I think is being taken at the moment in trying to deal with some of these issues and make it work. So the legal challenges, again, cross-boundary, it's all at different levels. We've dealt with Murray-Darling, but, even more locally, there are a lot of cross-boundary issues that aren't clear, and it is about coordination and how we structure ourselves and manage some of these more complex issues. Unclear ownership of watercourses, access on water sources on private land, rights and ownerships for non-prescribed water resources, and potential liabilities are seen as some of those challenges through that interview process. And like I said, some of these have been followed up, but also drawn out in terms of those case studies. I should have mentioned that this project is obviously underway and will be delivered by the end of the year. And this is really in line with, and I'll get it to a slide in a moment, but feeding into that some of the policy processes and looking at what options we have and really providing good advice on some factual information to help governments make decisions about how we can manage some of these complexities and optimise delivery of the diversified water supply for Adelaide. And that it leads to that governance arrangement. And there was, I think, a bit of a split in terms of some of the feedback that was received through that process. So there are some that thought, we need a new structure, like the Stormwater Management Authority, that would coordinate and centralise some of these things. But then you look at, other views that, there really are too many organisations already. We have existing structures. Let's utilise those more effectively and have leadership from one agency, for example, JUNA. So as I mentioned, this project is, can I do this? Yep. This one here, it is a relatively small project for the Goyder Institute, but it's really designed at linking one of our larger projects, which is the Optimal Water Mix for Adelaide, which is looking at the more technical analysis of all the different diversified water supplies in Adelaide and how we might deliver those to optimise against water security, environmental, social and economic outcomes for metropolitan Adelaide, with some more detailed analysis on, well, if we do have particular options and how they play out, what are those governance challenges that we might face in actually delivering and implementing that. And at the same time, there is leadership shown by government in terms of developing an integrated urban water policy for Adelaide. And so this project is also trying to provide some support into that process as well. So just to summarise, and sorry, I'm not involved in this project, so I have been really, really brief over the results and the approach. And I'm sure if you do have detailed questions, Jennifer Mackay would be more than happy to talk to you in detail about the project, and I'm happy to give you her contact details during the course of the day. But just to summarise that, not surprisingly, the results indicate there's complexity in how we're managing or in actually implementing a diversified water supply, and it's consistent across a range of experts. And those case studies are providing further detail about some of those issues to give that evidence base to substantiate the perceptions that water experts have. At the moment, Jennifer's conducting a more detailed interview process to really focus in on some of those key issues that have been identified in that first scoping piece of work. And this further analysis will also consider those options from the optimal water mix as well as the policy directions, and is due to finish at the end of 2020.